Behind the gavel, when justice wore a mask of addiction, the confession dropped into the Family Feud studio like a gavel striking marble, sharp, final, and echoing with the weight of decisions that could never be undone. Steve Harvey stood at his podium, his perpetual confidence momentarily shattered as he processed what he'd just heard. The bright studio lights that normally energized the room suddenly felt like interrogation lamps, illuminating not just the stage but the devastating reality of what addiction could hide behind success. 45-year-old Victoria Whitman stood at the contestant podium in her impeccably tailored navy suit and pearls, every inch the distinguished federal judge she had become. Her silver hair was pulled back in the kind of elegant chignon that commanded respect in courtrooms across the nation. But in her blue-gray eyes that had looked into the souls of criminals and victims with equal compassion, there was a tremor that expensive clothes couldn't conceal. "We asked 100 people," Steve had announced with his signature enthusiasm. "Name something you hide from people at work." He'd expected the typical responses that would generate knowing laughs and relatable nods. Personal problems, maybe. Financial stress. Relationship drama. The kinds of secrets that were embarrassing but ultimately harmless. The sort that would light up the board and keep the show moving toward its inevitable entertaining conclusion. Instead, Judge Whitman looked directly into his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had spent decades delivering verdicts that changed lives, and spoke 13 words that would transform this episode from entertainment into something approaching a court of confession. "That I need vodka to make life-changing decisions." The studio fell into a silence so profound it seemed to absorb sound itself, not the comfortable quiet of anticipation, but the devastating silence that follows a truth so dangerous it threatens to unravel everything. Steve's signature smile didn't just falter. It collapsed entirely as he recognized the magnitude of what she'd revealed. The implications hit the room like a physical force. This wasn't just a personal admission of addiction. This was a federal judge, someone whose decisions affected constitutional law, civil rights, criminal sentencing, and the fundamental principles of justice, confessing that she made those decisions while under the influence of alcohol. Behind the cameras, producers scrambled to understand what was happening. This wasn't part of any show format they'd trained for. Contestants were supposed to be entertaining, relatable, focused on winning prizes and having fun. They weren't supposed to confess to potentially impeachable offenses on national television. Judge Victoria Whitman had been appointed to the federal bench 8 years ago. After a distinguished career as a prosecutor and then a state court judge, she was respected by colleagues, feared by criminals, and admired by law students who saw her as proof that women could reach the highest levels of the legal profession. Her decisions were cited in law school textbooks, her opinions quoted in legal briefs, her integrity considered unassailable. What nobody knew was that for the past 15 years, Victoria had been drinking vodka from a water bottle hidden in her desk drawer. What started as a way to calm pretrial nerves had evolved into a dependency that now controlled every aspect of her professional and personal life. "Judge Whitman," Steve said softly, setting down his cards and moving away from his podium. The formality of her title somehow made the moment more surreal, acknowledging that this woman wasn't just a contestant, but someone whose confession could shake the foundation of the justice system itself. "What do you mean by that?" The question opened floodgates that Victoria had been keeping sealed through years of careful control, professional therapy sessions she attended under false names, and the meticulous construction of a public persona that hid her private hell. Her composed judicial demeanor began to crack, revealing the woman drowning behind the robe. She began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had learned to speak clearly even when intoxicated. "That every morning before I take the bench, I drink 3 ounces of vodka mixed with orange juice. I tell myself it's to steady my nerves, to help me focus, to make me a better judge." The Whitman family, her husband Robert, her adult daughter Sarah, her son Michael, and her sister Patricia stood at their team podium in various stages of shock. They'd known about her drinking, had staged interventions, attended family therapy sessions, but they'd never heard her admit the full extent of how her addiction had infiltrated her professional life. Last month, Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength even as tears gathered in her eyes, I sentenced a young man to 15 years for drug trafficking. I made that decision after consuming approximately 6 ounces of alcohol throughout the morning. I told myself I was being tough on crime. But the truth is, I don't know if I was being just or if I was being drunk. The rival family, the Garcia clan from Texas, stood frozen at their podium. They were a working-class family who had always respected authority, trusted the justice system, believed that judges were infallible guardians of fairness. They'd come for fun and prizes, not to witness the collapse of their faith in institutional integrity. How long has this been going on? Steve asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 15 years, Victoria answered immediately. It started when I was a prosecutor. High-pressure cases, long hours, the weight of knowing that my decisions could put innocent people in prison or let guilty people go free. I started having a drink before closing arguments, just to calm my nerves. She paused, looking out at the studio audience, 300 people who represented the American public she had sworn to serve with integrity. By the time I became a state judge, I was drinking before every major decision. By the time I reached the federal bench, I couldn't function without it. I've presided over murder trials, constitutional challenges, civil rights cases, all while maintaining a blood alcohol level that would make it illegal for me to drive a car. The studio was so quiet that the hum of air conditioning seemed deafening. Camera operators who had filmed hundreds of tapings found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. A sitting federal judge confessing to judicial misconduct on live television. My law clerks, Victoria said, her voice breaking. They're brilliant young lawyers who work 18-hour days, researching cases, writing opinions, believing that they're part of something noble and important. They don't know that the judge they respect, the mentor they trust, has been making decisions through an alcoholic haze. Steve found himself moving closer to her, drawn by recognition of a pain that transcended professional boundaries. This wasn't just about addiction, it was about the corruption of trust, about what happens when the people society depends on for stability become the source of instability. Victoria, Steve said, using her first name now, stripping away the formal distance. What's the worst part? The worst part, she said, and now tears were flowing freely, is that I don't know if any of my decisions were right. I don't know if the people I sent to prison deserved to go there. I don't know if the constitutional interpretations I wrote were sound legal reasoning, or alcoholic rambling dressed up in legal language. The Garcia family had abandoned any pretense of competition. Maria Garcia, a court reporter who had spent her career believing in the sanctity of legal proceedings, whispered to her husband, "How many judges are like this? How many decisions are made this way?" 2 weeks ago, Victoria continued, I decided a case involving a father's custody rights. He was fighting for visitation with his children after his ex-wife moved across the country. I ruled against him, and he broke down crying in my courtroom. That night, I went home and realized I had made that decision after drinking my lunch. Steve Harvey had spent decades hosting television shows, meeting thousands of people, hearing countless confessions and revelations. But standing there looking at Judge Victoria Whitman, he saw something that demanded more than entertainment value. He saw the collapse of everything people needed to believe about justice, fairness, and the integrity of those in power. What made you realize you had a problem? Steve asked gently. Last month, Victoria said. I was reading an opinion I had written 6 months ago, a decision that affected voting rights in 3 states. As I read it, I realized I couldn't remember writing it. I couldn't remember the legal reasoning, couldn't remember the research, couldn't remember anything about the case except that I had ruled, and my ruling was now precedent that would affect millions of people. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver hip flask, ornate and expensive, the kind that might contain perfume or mints in a normal person's possession. This, she said, holding it up, goes with me everywhere. Court proceedings, judicial conferences, bar association meetings. I've never been caught because I've learned to function, to speak clearly, to appear competent even when I'm not. The studio audience began to react, not with applause or cheers, but with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car crash in slow motion. Some faces showed anger at the betrayal of trust. Others showed sympathy for someone clearly drowning in addiction. "How do you live with yourself?" Steve asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, only genuine curiosity about how someone carries such devastating weight. "I don't," Victoria answered simply. "I exist. I perform. I maintain the illusion of contents while my soul dies a little more every day. I've been sleepwalking through the most important job in our democracy while drunk." Steve felt something twist in his chest. This wasn't about typical addiction or personal weakness. This was about what happens when addiction infiltrates institutions that society depends on, when the people trusted to uphold justice become incapable of recognizing it themselves. "Victoria," Steve said, his voice stripped of all entertainment value. "What do you need?" "I need to resign," she answered, immediately, surprising everyone including herself. "I need to step down from the bench, check into rehabilitation, and spend whatever time I have left trying to understand how much damage I've done to people's lives." She looked directly into the camera, speaking to the millions of viewers who might include people she had sentenced, lawyers who had argued before her, citizens who had trusted in her integrity. "I need to apologize to every person whose case I decided while under the influence. I need to recommend that every decision I've made in the past 15 years be reviewed by sober judges who can determine whether justice was actually served." The admission hung in the studio air like a constitutional crisis, waiting to unfold. Steve began removing his suit jacket, his movements deliberate and symbolic. The jacket was charcoal gray, expensive, representing success and integrity earned through honest work. "Victoria," Steve said, draping the jacket around her shoulders, "this jacket represents something I've worked my whole life to achieve honestly. It represents success without compromise, achievement without corruption. You know what you need to do to earn the right to wear something like this again?" Victoria looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears and desperate hope. "You need to get sober," Steve said firmly. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone whose life you've affected, everyone whose trust you've betrayed, everyone who believes that justice should be blind to everything except truth." The jacket was a perfect fit for Victoria's frame, but it looked wrong on her somehow, as if integrity were a garment she had forgotten how to wear. "Your Honor," Steve continued, using her title with new meaning, "starts with honoring yourself enough to get help. It continues with honoring the people you've wronged by doing whatever it takes to make it right." Steve turned to address not just Victoria but the entire studio, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood that some moments transcend entertainment to become calls for justice. "To anyone watching this who has been affected by addiction and positions of power," he said, looking directly into the camera, "you deserve leaders who show up sober, who make decisions with clear minds, who put service above their own needs." He turned back to Victoria, his expression filled with both challenge and compassion. "And to you, Judge Whitman, I want you to know that your worth isn't determined by the takes you've made while sick. It's determined by what you do now that you've found the courage to admit the truth." The game show had been completely forgotten. This wasn't about points or prizes anymore. This was about accountability, about the price of addiction in positions of trust, about whether someone could find redemption after betraying everything they were supposed to protect. "There's something I want to share," Victoria said, reaching into her briefcase and pulling out a thick folder. "These are letters I've received over the years from people whose cases I decided. Thank you notes from families, grateful messages from lawyers, expressions of faith in the judicial system." She held up the folder, her hands shaking slightly. "I've been carrying these as reminders of why my work matters. But now I realize they're evidence of fraud. Every person who thanked me for fair treatment, received justice from someone who wasn't capable of delivering it. Steve studied her face, seeing not just shame but the beginning of something that might eventually become redemption. "What are you going to do with those letters?" he asked. "I'm going to use them to remember who I owe amends to," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger. "Every person who appeared before my bench deserves to know the truth about the condition of the person who decided their fate." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Victoria. "I'm writing down the name of someone I want you to call," he said. "She runs a treatment program specifically for professionals whose addictions have compromised their responsibilities. Doctors, pilots, engineers, people whose sobriety isn't just personal, it's public safety." Victoria took the card with trembling hands. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was a bridge between the life she'd been living and the life she might still save. As confetti fell and celebration music played, something unprecedented happened. Instead of celebrating her family's victory in the game, Victoria Whitman stood at center stage and did something no Family Feud contestant had ever done. She made a formal statement. "To everyone watching," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had learned over decades on the bench, "I am announcing my intention to resign from the federal judiciary, effective immediately. I will be entering a residential treatment program and cooperating fully with any investigations into my conduct." The studio erupted, not in applause but in the complex sound of people processing something they'd never expected to witness. A powerful person voluntarily surrendering power in service of truth. 6 months later, Steve Harvey received a letter from a rehabilitation facility in Minnesota. It came with a photo showing Victoria Whitman in casual clothes, gardening in what appeared to be a treatment center courtyard, her face clear in ways it hadn't been for years. "Mr. Harvey," the letter read, "I wanted you to thank you for giving me the platform to speak a truth I'd been hiding for 15 years. The consequences have been severe but necessary. I resigned from the bench, my law license has been suspended, and I'm facing multiple investigations into my judicial conduct." The letter continued, "But for the first time in 15 years, I'm sober. More than that, I'm honest. I've testified before congressional committees about addiction among federal judges, helped draft legislation for mandatory addiction screening for judicial appointees, and spoken at law schools about the signs of impairment that the legal profession has been trained to ignore. The most important part came at the end. 3 of my former law clerks have started a nonprofit organization that provides free legal services to people who believe their cases were decided by impaired judges. We're calling it Clear Justice, and we've already helped overturn 17 questionable sentences and secure new trials for cases where judicial impairment may have affected outcomes." Today, Victoria Whitman works as a counselor in a treatment program for professionals struggling with addiction. She's 3 years sober and will never sit on a bench again. But she's found a different kind of service, helping other professionals find their way back from the brink before their addictions destroy lives beyond their own. Her office wall features the framed Family Feud episode photo, Steve's business card, and letters from people whose cases have been reopened and fairly decided by sober judges. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important verdict you can render is the one that finds yourself guilty and commits to making amends. The gavel of justice, Victoria learned, weighs nothing when you're drunk and everything when you're sober. But truth, even devastating truth, has its own kind of power. The power to tear down what's broken and build something better in its place. Sometimes the most important case you'll ever decide is the one against yourself. And sometimes the only way to serve justice is to admit you've been incapable of recognizing it.